So we've been exploring the idea of health in relationship to meditation, and led us to consider what we mean by the experience of God and how it is faith expressed in the word of silence that brings us into this experience, but the experience itself is the foundation of all experience. Everything that we experience is potentially, or is, if we were to see it properly, an experience of God. Perhaps the primary way in which we enter into this experience is through love. If in the Christian understanding, God is love, which is quite a powerful summary of the whole of the belief system. That God is love, and whoever loves lives in God and knows God, and whoever does not love, the unloving, know nothing of God. So love, we could say then, in whatever form it grabs us, offers us an immediate and privileged, in a way, but also most accessible experience of God. And love, although it is simple, is mysterious. And the mystery of it is that this hound of the Baskervilles is looking at us, expressed his opinion of us graphically just then. That the nature of love in the Christian understanding is expressed in the doctrine of the Trinity, that God, this experience of God we talk about, is not monistic, but is communal. That God is a communion. And if God is love, this, I suppose, makes sense, that there has to be relationship. It's difficult to imagine love without relationship. Who or what do you love unless there is a relationship? If you love yourself, as the doctrine of the Trinity suggests, that absolute love of self has to create or has to be expressed in relationship. Anyway, we won't go into the mystical doctrine of the Trinity, but the important thing is that the image of God we're dealing with here is not the theistic, monistic image of God that we argue about, and does God exist, and God against science, and this sort of it often seems rather old-fashioned way of speaking about God now, especially as most of the great scientists of the 20th century and since have ended up with a mystical vision of reality. So expressing their understanding of the material world, the universe, in terms that are very similar to the language and the insights of the mystics. So we'll just start from that point of understanding God as love and as communion, and this creates the sort of the basic model, the model of reality, which is expressed and underlies everything. If the experience of God is the basis of all experience, and this model of God, this understanding of God as communion, similarly becomes the universal template of reality. So this is expressed, for example, when Jesus is asked, what is the greatest of the commandments? They were always arguing about that. And his reply was, of course, to love the Lord your God with your whole heart, your whole strength, your whole mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And these are, one is like unto the other as commands. So to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself are actually two sides of the same coin. So we see here the fusion, really, of the theology with the psychology, or the religious vision and the sort of domestic or personal vision of life. So there are three aspects of love then, just as there are three persons in the Trinity. The three aspects of love are God, others, and myself. And if that's the theological order in which you express it, the psychological order is probably the reverse. We have to start with ourselves. If we cannot love ourselves, to know ourselves, to accept ourselves, to forgive ourselves, all the different ways in which love expresses itself, to like ourselves even. I mean, how many people actually like themselves? You may not like the way you look, or the shape of your body, or you may not like your temperament, or your addictions, or your failures. There are lots of things we may not like about ourselves, but do we like ourselves? That's a pretty fundamental element of getting on in the world. So our relationship with ourselves then, loving ourselves, is quite obviously the basis of the way we relate to other people. What kind of mood we're in is going to just determine how we handle other people, especially when we're under stress or pressure. If we're feeling out of sync with ourselves, out of harmony with ourselves, then we're going to be that much more irritable, that much more intolerant, that much more impatient. And that will express itself, if not in actual words, then in tone and gesture. So our relationship with ourselves is really fundamental to our relationship with others. And as St. John says, how can you love God whom you cannot see unless you love the one another whom you can see? So these three aspects of love are really inseparable, although they are distinct. That we cannot develop in the same way that persons of the Trinity are theologically distinct but inseparable. Where you have one, you have the other two as well. So, what does this tell us about health? I think it tells us that health is not just about how I relate to myself, physically say. Is my body behaving itself? Is it causing me pain? Is it eating itself up with a cancer? Or is my body functioning well? Is my mind and my emotions, am I more or less in control of my emotions, or am I masked into control by my unconscious and by my addictions or by my fears and neuroses? So these are important aspects of our health, but they're only one aspect of our health. Our health is also relational, perhaps even more important than our relationship with ourselves physically, is our relationship with other people. You may be in good health, but be in a state of alienation and suspicion or disjuncture from other people. Or you can be sick physically, and yet your loving relationships hold you up, hold you together, and help you to endure. And then this third dimension, which we don't quite know how to measure, or even to describe very easily, our relationship to God is clearly another aspect of our health, or perhaps the foundation of our whole health system. This expresses itself, I think, in our relationship within the medical world. The people who come to see you with their problems, and if you, with a little bit of experience and sensitivity, you pretty quickly see that the physical and the psychological aspects of the person impinge on each other, depending upon your schedule and depending on your sensitivity. You may say, well, okay, it's my job just to deal with physical symptoms. I'm not a psychologist. Or the reverse, you may be a psychologist and you say, well, somebody else is concerned to help them deal with their headaches or their insomnia, or their pain. Or you may be sensitive to a way of treating them which takes account of all of these dimensions. That would seem to be where we are truly helping someone to be healthy, that we are conscious, aware that as a person they have these three dimensions just as we do, and they may be coming to us for one particular dimension, but that doesn't mean to say we can't be aware of or even touch into, on occasion, some of those other dimensions. An example of that was Patricia Ing, who we saw on the video the other day, in that extended period of chemotherapy that kept her alive for 19 months. She started a meditation group in the hospital, and she and her doctor started it together. And when she died, the group continued, the doctor, the oncologist, continued the group with her. I said that we can discover this experience of God anywhere, in birth and death and everything in between. But we also need to seek it. If we don't seek it, if we're not conscious of its existence, of its emergence, then we have the experience but we miss it at the same time. We miss the meaning. And that means we have to be humble enough and free enough to admit that we are looking for something, that there is a need in us, a hunger in us, an incompleteness in us that we are addressing. In fact, this experience of God has already to be happening, activated. It is at the core of our humanity, it's what makes us human, or we wouldn't even be seeking for it. Gregory of Nyssa says that if we are reassured by the words of Jesus that if we seek God, we will find. Or if we seek, we will find. So if we seek God, we will find God. But he goes on to say that is true, but it's also true that when we find God, we find that we're still seeking Him. We're just seeking, we're in a continuous and eternal search and finding. And this understanding of the experience frees us from thinking that it is an experience that we can, as it were, master or add to our sum total of other experiences. This sometimes happens when people have an experience during meditation. Do you mind if we open the window? Is it too
proper.
Cold food.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Mind opening the door there. People have an experience in meditation, and they say, "Well, I don't get many of these experiences, so I really treasure this one, and how can I get it again? And what was I doing that made it possible for me to have this experience?" So we really do need to be sort of trained or formed or taught an approach to meditation that allows us certainly to have these experiences if they come, but not to try to package them or to possess them or to repeat them. That explains what might seem Father John's rather sort of deflating approach to experience when he speaks about meditation. He says, in meditation nothing happens, and if something does happen, ignore it. The point he's making, he's emphasizing, exaggerating perhaps, but is that we shouldn't be looking for these things to happen, and that's the wisdom of the great mystical traditions. In India, for example, I notice, in some other parts of the world too, where they have a strong tradition and culture of religious experience, in a way that we in the secular scientific West have lost much more, although we still have our holy wells, I suppose, and our every so often statue and Mary in some village begins to shake or weep, and thousands of people come. So we're not completely secularized, but on the whole, we treat that kind of experience quite skeptically, and the more educated, I suppose, one is, the less likely one would be to get involved in it. Because in India and other countries, perhaps where the unconscious, I don't know, hasn't been quite so thoroughly suppressed by rational education, it's very common for people to speak about these kinds of experience, psychic, physiological experiences or psychological experiences in meditation or at other times. But even within the Indian tradition, there's a clear distinction between the yogi and the sannyasi, or the one who is pursuing wisdom. The yogi is regarded as kind of a technician in a way, maybe more than a technician, but somebody who is working with the body and the mind, and certain expert yogis will win fame for themselves for developing certain powers, psychic powers. And that's always sort of attractive. But the mystical tradition, the wisdom tradition in India, distinguishes itself from that and says, on this path, you are neither looking for these experiences, nor if they happen, as they may happen to some people may be more inclined to them than others. If they do happen, A, don't make any money out of it, don't publicize it, and don't get attached to it. Mm-hmm. You see, that's one of the vows that the Buddhist monk takes, is precisely in that, to promise to do that. So, we need to be careful about our understanding of the word experience. And what we've been talking about is the experience of God or the experience of meditation. Shouldn't be confused with these kind of particular experiences that may or may not happen during the meditation. And yet at the same time, we can't deny that this is a way of experience. I was talking to someone recently who's been teaching meditation for quite a few years now, very effectively. And he's a type A personality, and so he's never satisfied with what he's achieved or what he has learned. And he's convinced that he's never had an experience in meditation. And he said to me, he said, you know, I've meditated all these years and nothing has ever happened. And before I could say anything, he said, I know nothing is supposed to happen, but nothing has happened. So I said, well, that's all the more credit to you that you've kept going and struggled with your distractions all these years, and you're in the desert, and yet you've been so helpful to other people and helped them to get into this path, and you've got nothing out of it yourself. And then he changed tack, of course, and said, I didn't say that. He said, I just said nothing has happened, but my whole life has completely changed.
Yeah.
So what do we mean by experience?
Yeah. Maybe he didn't see angels and...
Yeah, he didn't levitate, he didn't see visions, he didn't have, you know, illuminated experiences. So what are we looking for then? We have to seek this experience, and yet we're not supposed to look for anything. So what does it mean to seek?
Fidelity.
Fidelity. Okay, yes, all right. Fidelity. What else? How else would you describe it? So, and this is very important when you're introducing meditation to people. They'll get quite disconcerted because they'll say, you know, it doesn't matter how many times you give the basic teaching on leaving your thoughts behind, people will say, you know, what am I supposed to think about? Or what's supposed to happen? You know, I'm not doing it properly. That's a very common expression. I'm not doing it properly. So how do you? What am I supposed to be experiencing?
Nothing. Nothing.
Nothing. So that's not very. What's the point of nothing? Don't understand that. What's it supposed to be doing?
Is it creating an emptiness so that you can have an experience with God?
Yeah. What the experience of that?
Which may or may not come.
Yeah, that's right. It's just creating the emptiness. Is it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's why I was saying poverty of spirit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think if you've got a Christian language in common, you can explore the meaning of that poverty of spirit. If you don't have a Christian vocabulary in common, it's a little more difficult actually. You can do it.
The way I almost understand it is, by creating the emptiness, you find that there's something else other than this voice in your head. Because this voice and this chatter does keep breaking in all the time. And to realise that there's more than that that's not... I think that's what was quite enlightening for me. To realise that was separate from who I was. And so for me it's about finding out who I am, and the only way you can find that is in the emptiness, because the rest of it isn't reality. It's just stories and chatter.
Good, thank you. Yeah. So that's certainly a way, both within and outside the Christian language, you could say it is to find yourself, and it's basically you wouldn't. In doing that, you have to make a distinction between your ego and your your true self.
Would you be able to define ego? I've forgotten that meaning of ego.
Well, I said it's a healthy part of us that is responsible for the individuation process, for separation. So, at 2 years old, you begin to say no and to protest and to want to do your own thing. So it's that part of us that is both painful because it separates us from other people. On the other hand, it prevents us from collapsing totally into the other person the way that an infant does with its mother. It's almost indistinguishable from the other, from the mother. So we have to separate in order to make relationship. So the ego is the vehicle for that process. But we also carry the memories of those wounds, and the ego is also very easily distorted in the process, or becomes attached to the. Okay, so all right, so we're looking for nothing, but it's in the heart that one discovers that this nothing is not nothing. Poverty of spirit, purity of heart, these are traditional scriptural and terms from mystical traditions that allow us to articulate as best we can what is the process and what we are actually experiencing. So we need, I think, to have a grasp of that language. We need to know that language and to be able to handle it. Certainly if we want to understand it ourselves and pass it on to others. So I wanted to today, maybe we can take a little time to discuss this as well, is look at the context in which we make this search, in which this experience unfolds, in which our health becomes fully alive. And that is the context of let's say, of community. Although the word I'd like to use is koinonia. Koinonia is a Greek word from the Old Testament, from the New Testament. It's used 20 times in the New Testament. It's difficult to translate. It goes by different names. Sometimes it's translated as communion. I have a list here, but I can't find it now. Okay, well, sometimes as communion or participation, or a gift that is jointly given, a contribution. Because it's translated in different ways, we sometimes miss the importance of this concept, this idea in the language of the New Testament, koinonia. Just to give you a sense of what lays behind it, let's just listen to this description of the early church. And think, as we read this, of the institutions in which you work. They met constantly, this is in the early church in Jerusalem, they met constantly to hear the apostles teach and to share the common life, that's koinonia, to break bread and to pray. A sense of awe was everywhere, and many marvels and signs were brought about through the apostles. All whose faith had drawn them together held everything in common. They would sell their property and possessions and make a general distribution as the need of each required. With one mind they kept up their daily attendance at the temple, and breaking bread in each other's houses, shared their meals together with unaffected joy, as they praised God and enjoyed the favour of the whole people. And day by day the Lord added to their number those whom he was saving.
Where's that from?
That's Acts 2. Here's a picture not only of the early church, but really a very nice way of living.
Could be a bit overbearing.
With the net run out of money very quickly.
Very practical. What may have been one of the extenuating circumstances, one of the reasons that they were motivated to live in this extremely communitarian
I
way?
presume they thought the end was coming
Yes.
very
Yeah. So you think the end is coming at any moment, it sort of certainly heightens your...
Yeah.
But if you live with, a presence of death every day, it makes sense to live in that way.
Yes.
You live with
With an awareness that you are going
awareness
to
of that.
Yeah.
Could be mine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we
Which,
could die every day.
So,
We could die every day.
yeah.
I suppose the persecution as well might be a factor.
Yes.
Together.
It does. I mean, this sounds very idyllic and peaceful, but actually they were
Protective.
being persecuted,
Yeah.
and they weren't immune to internal conflicts.
But there's some guy who didn't, who kept back one field.
Yes, that's
But he died.
within one chapter. You've got Ananias. There he is. Yeah, who was one of their group. Where's he gone? Anyway. But yeah, he was a cheat and saving money. But anyway, that was very easily dealt with because he was struck down dead.
Yeah.
They didn't have to resolve the conflict.
And
But
so
it was the fact that he
it was an
was...
accident.
There could have been some good herbs. St. Paul was always writing to them to get them to stop fighting, wasn't he? He wanted to.
Yeah, so maybe it wasn't quite as idealistic as that.
Well, let's keep the two. I think if he was trying to, St. Luke, if he was trying to present an idealistic picture, he wouldn't have put in all the other stuff.
Yeah, no,
He wouldn't have told us about Ananias. He wouldn't have told us about the conflict between Peter and Paul
Yeah.
and all the rest. So there are two things going on. One is a very strong experience of koinonia that allowed them, at least for a while, to live with this extraordinary sense of community, of sharing, holding all things in common, and being happy together. While at the same time dealing with the normal conflicts of community and relationship. He doesn't pretend that there aren't these difficulties or persecutions around. A little later, he repeats this vision, or this description. The whole body of believers was united in heart and soul. Not one of them claimed any of his possessions as his own, but everything was held in common, while the apostles bore witness with great power to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. They were all held in high esteem, for they had never a needy person among them. So they were generally regarded as a good group of people. Like have a group of immigrants in a country, and the host country that forms an opinion of them says, they're hardworking, they're very honest, they keep themselves to themselves, but I've no problem with them. They're a really good group. So it's almost as if the Jews or the Romans or whoever they were looking at the Christians in this way. They were held in high esteem. They never had a needy person among them. because all who had property in land or houses sold it, brought proceeds of the sale and laid the money at the feet of the apostles. It was then distributed to any who stood in need. But this was the inspiration for Christian monasticism. They look back to this early church in Jerusalem as something they wanted to recreate, and made an attempt to do it.
But the desert fathers did the exact opposite.
In what way?
In the sense that they went out from a community. Live on their own.
Well, yes, in a way, but two forms of life began in the desert. One was the hermit's life, and the other was the community life. But even the hermits,
There's a part.
see, as I said at the beginning of the week, we're kind of living out that model in our own little cells, but we come together.
Yeah.
And they did that.
They did hermit traditionally, didn't they? They used to go from the community, but they used to come back
The community.
again. Wouldn't that be a tradition? No,
Yeah.
hermits didn't live in their own place.
No.
They're part.
Well, the anchorite was different from the hermit. The anchorite would be walled up and completely separate. But even that, it's very difficult to imagine complete isolation. It's like the definition of emptiness. Julian of Norwich in the 14th century was an anchoress, which means that she was walled up in a little, well, quite a nice little house. You can go and visit it in Norwich. Little self-contained little house of 2 or 3 rooms next to the church. But she had a window through which she would talk to people when they came to see her. So you might say, well, why bother wall yourself up if you're going to talk through the window? But I think it depends on your personality. And we all, we all need time alone. Probably some of your friends or family might think you're a little bit weird, wanting to come away for a whole week on a meditation retreat on an island in the middle of nowhere. Others would say, oh, I wish I could do that. So temperamentally, we're different. We have different degrees of the need for different degrees of solitude. So anyway, what we see here is that this very powerful central Christian idea of koinonia, communion, of sharing, of happy fellowship, is not really utopian. It's an ideal, but it's not utopian, because it can be lived in a place. Utopia means literally nowhere, no place. Whereas this ideal may not be easy to realize, and you may only fully realize it briefly. From time to time, have experiences of it. But it's something that is located in a place and in a real group of human people who will sometimes also lie and cheat and stir their cup of tea very noisily at breakfast, and generally, get on. We get on each other's nerves in all sorts of ways. So conflicts arise. So what's interesting too about this description of the early Christian community, which was probably, I don't know, a few decades at the most, was that they were highly energized. They had a strong sense of purpose. So again, it's asking to think about the institutions and professions in which you live or work. This is what management consultants are trying to reproduce, or trying to keep us believing in, that we can work together as a highly motivated team, and we can know what we're there for, and we have clear objectives, and we support each other, and we have all of these wonderful systems in place that help us to achieve this. What the New Testament is describing is a kind of communal intimacy. And this is an experience that not many people have at work or in many parts of their lives. They may have intimacy, one-to-one intimacy, for periods of time anyway. But this experience of intimacy in community, or in koinonia, is much more rare in our society, I think. This is why so many people are looking for community, why many young people are looking for it. One young daughter of a friend of mine said she had to write a list of the things she wanted to achieve in her lifetime, and I think the second of 10 of those was to be a local. To be a local. And it wasn't as if she wasn't sort of travelling around the world all the time with her parents. She was quite geographically stable. But what she expressing was the need to feel that you belong to a particular group, that you have a place, that you're recognized, or you have an identity within that group. And this communal intimacy is, of course, a balance between our need for solitude, our experience of solitude, and our need for community and relationship. For the Christian community here in Jerusalem, what created that koinonia so effectively, and we would say still creates Christian community, is the understanding of the experience that Jesus joins the group. It is joining the group. That it's not merely a group of people coming together because they have a lot of common interests, or they like each other, or they like playing golf together, or they like reading scripture together even. But that there is an experience of otherness. What you just said, and what Etty Hillison described too, the sense of so it's an experience of friendship in Christ for the Christian. For the Christian, this knowledge is the particular element that makes teamwork, for example, a spiritual and Christocentric experience. You think of, ideally anyway, why we would have talked about Christian hospitals or Christian schools. It had to be because these are social institutions, and they run with teamwork. They have to be well managed, and the accounts have to be done. Some people have to be dismissed, or have to be hired. So they're social institutions, but they can be called and are spiritual because of this awareness of Christ and joining the group in some way through the individuals and beyond the individuals. So this, perhaps another word for this is friendship. Philia, the Greek concept of philia. Again, we think of philia, friendship, as a very individual thing. We have our very close friends, our very special friends, our friends we can trust in all circumstances. Yes, of course. But for the Greek mind, friendship was certainly the crowning of the personal life. A life without a friend is not worth living, they would say. But it was also seen as a civic virtue. And it was one of the ways in which the society and the institutions work together virtuously or strongly and well. And so this quality of friendship, which has become much diminished in our set of values, or very individualized in our value system, was very central, for example, to the monastic movement. Friendship was really the heart, the human heart of the monastic experience. So let's just call that to mind, this understanding of koinonia as a way of people living together, dealing with their conflicts and their individual problems, while at the same time being together in a common mind and mind and heart, with a common purpose, working together for some common goal. And compare that with our own institutions today. And then Illich, the prophetic figure of the 70s, says that we've moved out of an age of technology into an age of systems. And in this age of systems, he would say this happens in medicine and in education and so on. The client was professionalized. That the person receiving at the receiving end of what the institution had to offer, education or health, internalized within themselves this thing that they wanted to get from the institution, whether this was health or education or whatever. And we classify ourselves in these terms. Now he says this has actually moved on, and in the age of systems that we inhabit, we have actually now been swallowed by the system itself. You can see this in the way the language of politics has changed. And we are now subsystems of the big system. I mean, I'm putting this out for you to respond to now. And this is, I think, a good way of understanding why we're facing certain problems so intensely that we didn't face before. I mean, take the problem of dying, for example. I mean, doctors are now going to be asked, not only to perform abortions, but also to kill patients, if the law so prescribes. That's going to become an ethical issue more and more, probably. So the body itself has been reduced to a system within a system. And because we are swallowed by the system, we have to live within it. Now, in that light, in the light of that vision of where we are culturally and socially, you may or may not agree with that, where does meditation fit in? Why does meditation create community, as John Main said? What happens in the silence of meditation? And why does the meditative silence seem to draw people together like a beehive? Why does it bring people together to share this experience of nothing together? I think that question, maybe we can look at that tomorrow together, that question is an important question, not only for our own personal journey of faith, but also for the concerns we have about the work we're doing, the society we are bequeathing to our children, and the systems that we have created to live in. Meditation may have an very important role to play in addressing those issues and problems.